So much for joining us. Let's talk about the first time that you met Mr. Mandela. Share with us that experience.
I met him for the first time indirectly in Kingston, Jamaica, just after his release from prison. I believe that it was either France, for some reason, or Jamaica that he first visited. And I happened to be there on a lecture at the university. And when I heard he was coming through, I just couldn't believe my luck, because it was shortly after his release. And but then I'd always felt that I knew him. I felt that I had no problem at all entering his mind, the kind of person that he was. And when we eventually met, on that occasion we didn't speak. You know, I was part of a crowd, and became quite close to him, but it was mobbed, of course, by everybody. And but then I looked and I said, this is a man who's been in my imagination for so long, about whom I've written poems, to whom I dedicated my Nobel acceptance speech. And let's just say that it was exactly as I'd always pictured him. And later on, as I got to know him and interacted, I found him very warm, full of sense of mischievous, very mischievous. And I grew to like him, and he became like a kind of elder brother to me.
Now, you've said that he was mischievous. Can you tell us a bit more about his character? Why do you say that?
Well, first of all, I think I would describe it as a man of quiet courage. That, I think, on the spur of the moment would be the best way I would describe him. My projection of him and what he exuded also when finally I saw him. The kind of person who doesn't miss a beat, no matter what conditions he's moving into or from. That kind of very self-possessed, you know, man of great composure, but also capable of flashes of anger and outright uncompromising commitment.
You've mentioned that he was someone you had imagined and thought about, dedicated poems to even. Why was it that you felt so connected to him?
His concern for human dignity is something which I share very passionately. Freedom, you know, the right of all human beings to that elementary possession called freedom, which is what drove him. I didn't see him, for instance, I saw him as somebody who would conduct his life, who chooses commitment exactly the same way if he were not black. If he happened to be a member of a contemned group, race, religion, whatever, that's really what struck me about him, that this thing which drove him was something that penetrated his entire being, his psyche, irrespective of what he happened to be. And that is something which struck me very forcibly. And every encounter that I met, whether in a light, you know, under very light circumstances, or engaged in intense argument, you know, agreed with you or disagreed with you, it is always the same kind of inner conviction that I think that's shown through him.
So if we look at his political career, what sort of impact did he have on West Africa, but more specifically Nigeria?
I wouldn't talk so much, I wouldn't want to say very much about Nigeria, because Nigeria has always been very self-absorbed because of its own internal problems, not just decolonization, but what I call the second and third waves of decolonization. I'm talking about the internal colonial powers, like the military, or else the ruling clique, which really doesn't believe in democracy. So Nigeria has been in a state of crisis for so long that it would be accurate to say that the average Nigerian was not as conscious of Mandela as a figure, a political figure with enormous meaning for their own problems. You see, it is very different in the colonial period when, for instance, Jomo Kenyatta was named. Now, during that period, I remember I was younger, and the name of Jomo Kenyatta had a direct impact on the nature of the struggle in Nigeria. But of course, after decolonization, totally new set of problems began, and Nigerians became, I suspect, a bit more wary, skeptical about, figures. They're looking at those inside who had taken the place of the departed colonialists. But that is not to suggest for 1 second that for West Africans, Nigerians, and so on, Mandela was a towering figure, and a kind of model of human aspiration. But I think that he was sort of regarded as a figure remote in a different zone of concerns who had no real direct impact on the struggle and the problems within the West African setting. If this had not been the case, for instance, I imagine that the kind of trauma we'd undergone from Liberia to Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and so on, would more easily have been mediated by a reference to the example of Mandela. That really is what the distinction I'm trying to get at.
You've described him as a remote figure to the average Nigerian, but he did try and get involved regarding the former head of state, Sani Abacha. Can you tell us about that dispute?
Well, just remember that Sani Abacha was just a brute. He was an uncouth, murdering dictator with absolutely no sophistication, no intelligence, whatever. All he had was animal cunning. And he responded. He would respond to God himself if he came down to earth and tried to intervene in African affairs. He would never be able to see the person, the mediator, in that mediator's context. No. For him, it was a brutish keep. And of course, he was served by some real sycophantic, bootlicking characters like who was the minister at the time? Was it Onogoru or somebody like that, who actually transmitted that message? And then you had somebody like Thomas Ikime, who said that Mandela was still, obviously still affected by his prison, times. Can you imagine people like that? These are the sort of people Abacha surrounded himself with. Can you imagine one human being, never mind what rank that person holds, mocking the prison travails of another human being? Prison travails endured on behalf of right, on behalf of humanity. Now, those are the kind of, the kind of subhumans running this country at the time. So I wouldn't like you to judge Nigerians by the aberrations which happened to hold power at that time. And Nelson Mandela, of course, his response when Ken Saro-Wiwa was hanged, that for me is what is most interesting. That spontaneous human outrage, in very, very angry and threatening. This for me was the real Mandela. Afterwards came the, shall we say, the pragmatic statesman, who now wanted to operate in the context of this so-called African family way of settling things, something which I have a copy of the letter. It was smuggled to me while I was in exile, battling Sani Abacha, of the letters, the two exchanges, the one by Nelson Mandela and the one by Sani Abacha, in which he wrote, very, very interesting documents.
What can Nigerian leaders learn from Mr. Mandela's example?
That actually is very easy to answer, and it's not just Nigeria alone. It's for all of Africa. It applies very much to Zimbabwe. It applies to Libya, and of course, most tragic of all, current events in Ivory Coast, and what they could take, away for Mandela is the grace of yielding. It's the grace of yielding. When it's time to move and let other people take over and contribute their bit, whether it's a constitutional requirement or whether it's even a sense, an inner sense of, you know, I've occupied the stage, you know, long enough, let others take over. It's a rare quality, and it comes from an inner grace. And I'm not talking about spiritual grace, you understand? I don't believe in that kind of spiritual grace. I'm talking about a humanistic grace inside, which says, I'm just another being. I'm just another human being who's done all I can in the circumstances with what I have. And there's a, now it's time, I feel it's time to just move aside and let others carry on. And that is for me, for Nigeria, for all African countries, what they have failed tragically to learn from Nelson Mandela, because his example is there. Fortunately, he's still very much with us. He's a world iconic figure. One is reduced to cliches when trying to describe Mandela. I call him an avatar, you know, a most rare being among other beings. And the failure to see this as a goal, an aspiration in itself, this, I believe, if only one could reverse that process of viewing Mandela and let people see him as I have described him, that'll help, whether it's election time, it'll stop all the killings on account of votes, it'll stop all the rigging, it'll stop even the depletion of the national treasury for the sake of perpetuating yourself in office. Why do you perpetuate yourself? So you can steal, then you steal, so you can use the loot to perpetuate. I mean, this vicious cycle, to imagine that people don't want to just cut it, break it, and get back to normal human relationships. So anyway, that's what I think